So good afternoon, Dr. White. It's great to have you with us to talk a little bit about Mook Sea Farm and about your research and shed a little light on what's going on in the oyster industry these days. But before we get started, I just wanted to just give a little bit of information that I found out about you and ask you to add to it when you can. Along the way. So Meredith, Dr. White, leads the research and development efforts at Mook Sea Farm. She's originally from Massachusetts. Whereabouts in Massachusetts are you from?
I grew up in Andover.
Andover. I have friends that grew up there too. She received her BS, Bachelor of Science degree from Lafayette College and her PhD in Biological Oceanography from the MIT Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute Joint Program in Oceanography. That's a mouthful.
Mm-hmm.
Before joining Mook Sea Farm in 2016, Dr. White research focused primarily on understanding the effects of ocean acidification on a variety of marine organisms. She enjoys painting and various sea creatures while sipping a glass of wine or cider. When she isn't reading scientific papers, Dr. White can be found jamming out the bluegrass music. So welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I will now defer to you to give us any additional information about what you're doing and the kinds of research that you've been involved in.
Before I came to Mook Sea Farm, as you mentioned, my research was really focused on biological impacts of ocean acidification on a variety of species ranging from bay scallop larvae to phytoplankton, and also looking at phytoplankton zooplankton interactions. That work led to me being on Maine's Ocean Acidification Commission, which was formed in 2014. It was the first East Coast state to have a state level commission considering the impacts of ocean acidification on the state. In that role, I met Bill Mook, who is the owner of Mook Sea Farm. And I guess I had actually met him just very shortly before that, but that's where we really met each other. And so he was serving on the commission in the role of an aquaculturist who had been affected by ocean acidification, and I was there serving as a scientist. And as we continued to keep in touch over the next couple of years, he mentioned that he was looking to hire a research scientist, and the positions that I were in were all, as is normal in academia, temporary positions until you find your long-term position. And so I was interested in learning more about the opportunity that he had. And since I had experience raising larval bivalves and raising phytoplankton, microalgae, which is the food for larval bivalves, it seemed like a good fit for me to join Mook Sea Farm.
Thank you, Dr. White. We put together a number of questions for you, and we're eager to get started with them. We know you're busy, so I will defer to the instructors.
This brings it back to what you just said, but how'd you get into oyster farming and how do you like it so far?
Yeah, so when I was in graduate school, I never anticipated going into oyster farming or aquaculture, really. I guess I thought about it a little bit because my work involved raising larvae. But by the time I graduated with a PhD, I understood that I was probably overqualified to be a hatchery technician, and I am not personally an entrepreneur, so I wasn't looking to start my own business. So I didn't think that there would be opportunities for me in this field. So it was really wonderful when I connected with Bill Mook and found that he was looking to hire a research scientist, because that role would certainly make use of my scientific expertise while allowing me to be involved in this field. Since joining the oyster farming industry, I've really enjoyed it very much. It is an incredibly diverse job description where I do quite a bit of work on R&D projects that are focused in the hatchery. I also, and so that is raising the larval oysters to small seed that we sell to other farms. To raise those larvae, we have to grow phytoplankton in the hatchery, and so there's quite a bit of research that goes into that. We have actually expanded our microalgae production to create a new product that our company is selling, a microalgae paste that we sell to other shellfish farms. And so my role here has included product development. I also do work out on the lease site on the river, particularly in summer months when we have undergraduate interns here. So it's really dynamic and diverse, and it feels like a very practical way to apply my scientific skills in a setting where the results are used very immediately, instead of doing an experiment, writing a paper, waiting months for it to be reviewed and then published, and then waiting for people to read it and apply it to their own work and cite that paper. It's a very slow process. And here I do an experiment, and the results of that experiment can influence our operations as soon as the next day. And so it's very fast-paced and dynamic.
For the next question, I was wondering, the species of oysters that you're growing at Mook Sea Farm, what is their geographical distribution?
We grow the eastern oyster, also known as the American oyster. The scientific name is Chrysostrea virginica, and it ranges all the way from the Gulf of Mexico into the Canadian Maritimes. So it's also found in the Quebec and Prince Edward Island area.
Do the oysters grow from seeds or on a line, kind of similar to like seaweed?
We call young oysters seed, but that is not how they start out. They start out in our hatchery with the parent oysters that are called broodstock, and we get the parents to spawn. And oysters are broadcast spawners, so they release their gametes into the water. And then we have the eggs become fertilized, and we have embryos, and we raise, and then those develop into larvae. And we raise those in very, very controlled conditions in the hatchery until they are ready to metamorphose and become juveniles. And that transition is it's a good metaphor is the transition from a caterpillar to a butterfly, that metamorphosis from a larva to an older life stage. At that metamorphosis, they are juvenile oysters. They are very, very different from larvae, which swim in the water. Juveniles just sit on the bottom. And they are about 0.5 millimeter after they metamorphose. And we grow them up larger and larger in the hatchery. And at that point, we do call them seed. And we sell those seed to other oyster farms all along the East Coast, from North Carolina to Maine. We sell them when they are 1 to 2 millimeters in size.
The next question we have is actually one of my questions. I was wondering if the larvae grow in different holding containers than the juvenile oysters. So do you have them in the ocean, like in nets, or in holding tanks inside?
So larvae, at our hatchery, everything happens inside. All of the larvae and the seed that we ship to other farms have never been in the Damariscotta River. They've only been in water that we've pumped from the Damariscotta River into our hatchery, filtering it to 1 micron and then UV sterilizing it. And it is considered treated water, different from the water directly from the river. Larvae are planktonic, so they swim around in the water column, and we have giant tanks to hold those larvae. So tanks that are 3,000 to 6,000 liters. They're filled with millions of larvae swimming around. When the larvae are ready to settle, if they were not in a hatchery, they would be looking for another oyster or another shell to settle onto, because when they find that shell, that's a signal to them that there are other oysters nearby, and it will increase their reproductive success later in life. But that's why oysters form reefs. But we don't want our oysters to be big clusters, like in the wild, because our oysters are intended to be eaten raw on the half shell. And when you buy oysters raw, you want them to be individual single oysters. But they still want to find that little bit of oyster shell to settle onto as a signal for them to metamorphose and become a juvenile. So we get really finely ground up oyster shell that looks like sand, and we put that on a screen, and we put the larvae onto that screen in water with that finely ground up adult oyster shell. And the larva will go down to the bottom and find its little grain of shell, and it will cement itself to that little grain and start metamorphosing and becoming a juvenile. And so that's how we keep our oysters individual instead of clusters. And after that point, the oyster is on the bottom. It no longer has the ability to swim. And so from that point on, we raise the seed oysters in a system called upwellers, where there is a mesh at the bottom of a tube, and that tube is submerged in water, with water forced up through the mesh and oysters sitting on top of the mesh. And that movement of the water through the mesh lifts the small oysters off of each other so that they can all open up and filter and get their food, and they don't end up crushing each other. And so that's how we grow the juveniles in the hatchery.
Our next question, Pauline wants to know, can anyone grow oysters?
Anyone can get into aquaculture. There are training opportunities in Maine. There is a class called Aquaculture in Shared Waters, which is put on by a group of several different organizations, including Maine Sea Grant and the Island Institute, and I am sure that I will forget some of the other partners, so please excuse me for that. But that's a training program that will give people the introduction to what they need to know, first about the technical aspects of farming oysters, but also the regulatory and legal aspects, what they can expect when they start to work with the Department of Marine Resources to find a lease site. And that training program is really focused on the grow out for the farm side of aquaculture operations. So in the background behind me, that's an aerial image of Mook Sea Farm's lease site. And so that's the farm operations. That course is not specific to hatchery operations. And while technically anybody has the ability to get into hatchery operations, it is much more technically challenging with a higher initial investment of money necessary. And so to get into that, you would most likely go to college in aquaculture science and learn the specific scientific techniques that you need to work in a hatchery, because a hatchery is basically an industrial scale laboratory.
So for our next question, it was sort of answered already, but it's from Pauline. Can you grow oysters anywhere in Maine? Are there any places that are closed down to oyster growing?
That's a good question. And the short answer is no, you cannot grow them anywhere in Maine. The Department of Marine Resources has a map that highlights what areas are open to shellfish aquaculture and what areas are closed. And then some areas are conditionally opened or conditionally closed. And what they're doing is making sure that the area that they approve for shellfish aquaculture doesn't have any characteristics that might make people sick from growing shellfish in that area and then giving those shellfish to consumers. And so one of the big characteristics that they're looking at is the amount of bacteria, fecal bacteria in the water. And so they do measurements of E. coli in the water. If it's high, that area will be closed to shellfish aquaculture. So when someone wants to get into aquaculture, they need to look at that map and understand what areas are open, what areas are closed for harvest, and then they can apply to get their lease in an area that is open. There may be a situation where you could get a lease in a closed area, but you would need to move the oysters to an open area and show that they are safe to eat before they can be harvested from that area.
Is that where the Army Corps of Engineers comes in terms of determining lease sites?
They would not so much be involved in the kind of bacterial testing, but looking at how the farm may interfere or impact with the ecosystem and other uses of the area, so you can't interfere with existing uses of an area.
What are the different species of oysters we have in Maine?
Generally, all of the farms that are farming oysters are growing the same species, the eastern oyster, Chrysostrea virginica. It is technically the native oyster to Maine, but there are not very many native populations anymore. You can sometimes find oysters outside of an actual farm lease area, but they are likely to be spawned from oysters that were on a farm. So there are not that many truly wild eastern oysters left in Maine. Of oyster that we have in Maine, the European oyster, Ostrea edulis, or the Ballon, and those ones are also called the flat oyster. They have a very, very different taste and a very different shape. I don't believe that they are typically farmed. They are more harvested wild in Maine. But I could be wrong on that. It is possible that there is some farm growing them.
We recently found some in Lincoln Bay, and I shared that with you. So that's that. Do you think that those oysters that we're finding are from farms where they've drifted down into this area, or?
I do think that they originated from a farm. So as I mentioned, oysters are broadcast spawners, and so their larvae swim in the water. So once oysters have spawned, there's nothing holding the larvae on the farm site. In fact, they're very likely to be transported away from the original farm site. And then when they metamorphose, it's wherever they find a suitable habitat. And from what I understand about the wild oyster population in Maine, it's limited to a small area in the Sheepsket River and maybe a small area in the very south of Maine.
Do you only feed them the microalgae that you specifically grow?
So I would just like to clarify that this question is specifically for hatchery operations because we only feed oysters when they're in the hatchery. That is one of the really wonderful things about shellfish aquaculture. Once we move them out of the hatchery to the lease site, they no longer require food. And so it's a very sustainable form of agriculture. But in the hatchery, larvae are so sensitive to any changes in condition. They need the most optimal temperature, the most optimal pH, and they need really optimal nutrition as well. We start spawning our larvae in the hatchery in January. Normally in the wild, oysters wouldn't start spawning until the summertime. In January, there's very little phytoplankton in the sea at that time. That's not a time that there's typically a phytoplankton bloom. So we cannot rely on natural phytoplankton to be the appropriate nutritional source for larvae in our hatchery. Also, different phytoplankton species produce different kinds of lipids, which are necessary. That's like the nutrients that larvae need to grow. And so we want to feed them algae that we know have the best lipids for them. That means the highest content and also the right kinds of lipids for them. So we have to grow the microalgae cultures in the hatchery.
How do you grow the microalgae?
The really traditional way to grow microalgae is through a phototrophic system. And this is kind of what you learn about in high school biology, that algae needs light as an energy source and carbon dioxide as a carbon source so that it can perform photosynthesis. And so when you go to a shellfish hatchery, you're going to see a large room full of tubes or clear tubes or clear plastic bags full of different colored algae species in water. They are illuminated by fluorescent or LED lights, and that is the light source. And then you'll see that there are bubbles coming up through them, and those bubbles will have carbon dioxide added to them to supplement the carbon dioxide in the air. We do grow algae that way at Mook Sea Farm, but about 11 years ago, before I joined Mook Sea Farm, they invested in research and development to develop techniques to grow algae heterotrophically. And this is also a natural process. It's not new to science, but we kind of often don't learn about it in high school. In this case, the algae are able to use organic carbon as the light source and the carbon source. And so that organic carbon is basically sugar. We put a starter algae culture in seawater with sugar and some other nutrients, and they're able to use that sugar. And so it's actually a much, much more efficient way to grow microalgae because you're not dependent on light. It reduces the energy costs and you can grow more algae in the same amount of space. And so that is the method that we have adopted at Mook Sea Farm.
I saw on your website that you use both diploid and triploid oysters. Can you talk about the difference between those?
Okay, most animals are typically diploids, which means we have two sets of chromosomes. One set came from our moms and one set came from our dads. That's diploid. Triploid is 3 sets of chromosomes. And in this case, you create a triploid oyster by taking a tetraploid dad. That tetraploid oyster has 4 sets of chromosomes, and you get it to spawn. And then you get a diploid mom, female oyster, with 2 sets of chromosomes to spawn. And then you cross those gametes. And so you get 2 sets of chromosomes from the dad, 1 set from the mom. And so the offspring have 3 sets of chromosomes, or a triploid. And the offspring are sterile, so they don't reproduce. It's really important to understand that all of these genes are oyster genes. They're all oyster chromosomes. So this is not genetic modification. And that's really important for us to communicate to consumers, because many consumers are wary of genetic modification. Animals have a given amount of energy that needs to be split through all of their life processes. So when they're not putting energy into reproduction, like triploids are not doing that, they will have more energy available for growth, and they end up growing faster. And so that's one of the benefits of triploid oysters. Also, diploid oysters, they are reproductive. And so in the summertime, they will build up their gonadal tissue, and then they will spawn it out. And in that period after they spawn it out, the oyster meat is rather thin, and it's not considered a high quality product. And so diploids go through seasonal quality, from good quality to poor quality, but triploids don't have that same seasonal quality, and so they stay high quality year round.
How did you discover that the meat would be better or that they would grow faster? Did you experiment with different gametes?
Okay, so that Mook Sea Farm had nothing to do with developing triploid oysters. These triploid oysters were developed by shellfish geneticists at shellfish breeding laboratories, where they developed the tetraploid oysters. The original idea for it was that if those offspring, the triploids, were sterile, then they might be able to culture a non-native species. So for example, we might be able to grow Pacific oysters on the East Coast without worrying that they would spawn and get out and compete with wild populations. In fact, most triploids are sterile, but a very small number of them can reproduce. And so they never ended up being used to grow non-native species in a given area. But once they had developed the triploids, they did very quickly notice that they grow faster. And since they're sterile, they don't go through that seasonality of quality. So all of that was done years and years ago, and now it is generally the industry standard. Some farmers do prefer to grow diploid oysters, but many farmers prefer triploids. And so you have to start in the hatchery with tetraploid oysters, and those are maintained at shellfish breeding laboratories. On the East Coast, those laboratories are in Virginia and New Jersey at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science and Rutgers University.
How can you tell the difference between male and female oysters?
So when you just look at an oyster in its shell, it's really hard to tell the difference. You might be able to guess based on its size relative to the other oysters in its same population, because oysters start out as male, and as they grow, they switch and become female. So if you can see the oyster in the context of all the other oysters in its population, you can guess that the bigger oysters are female and the smaller oysters are male. But you won't know for sure until you shuck the oyster, which kills it. And then you take the gonadal tissue and look at it under a microscope, and then you can see if they are eggs or sperm.
I have a question from Cheyenne, one of our students. How long does it take for the oysters to typically grow?
That's a really great question, and there is not a definitive answer, but growth rate is really dependent on temperature, and so they will grow much faster in warmer waters, and they will also grow faster when there's more food for them. So that food is the phytoplankton. So in areas that have more phytoplankton, or at times of years when there is more phytoplankton, the oysters will grow faster. In aquaculture, we start to harvest our oysters when they are 2.5 inches, and that size, the length of time it takes for them to get to those 2.5 inches varies by location. Let's say in Virginia, where the waters are much warmer, they will reach that 2.5 inch size very quickly, like within a summer. But in Maine, it will take us usually, in the Demerskater River, where the water is much warmer than other areas in coastal Maine, it could take 18 to 24 months. In other parts of Maine, it's the kind of 24 months is the minimum to reach that 2.5-inch size.
How large could they grow in the wild?
There is almost nothing that limits the oyster growth. When they are very small, let's say like 1/2 inch or 1 inch in size, they're really vulnerable to predation by crabs and starfish. But after they get past that size, and as they grow, their shell becomes thicker and thicker. It's not just longer and longer. They can be quite resistant to predation. And aside from disease, there's not much that's going to get an oyster after they're a couple of inches long. Last week, I was out collecting wild oysters to use as broodstock in our hatchery. And I found shells from dead oysters. They were not alive, but they were 12 to 16 inches long. So they were quite huge. And so when you look at the hinge of an oyster or the cross section of an oyster shell, you can see really distinct layers that represent years of growth. And so of those giant shells that I found, the oldest one was 25 years old when it died. That's a pretty ancient oyster.
I have a question from Pauline. Why don't I find a pearl in every oyster?
Every bivalve has the potential to make a pearl, but it is not a typical thing for most bivalves to do. When we hear that oysters make pearls, that is not every species of oyster. So the oysters that make pearls that we typically see are actually a Pacific shellfish species that isn't even in the same genus as the eastern oyster. It's quite unrelated. So it is possible that Chrysostrea virginica, the eastern oyster, could make a pearl, but it's something like 1 in a million that you might find it. It's very, very rare. And probably it's going to be so small that you wouldn't even notice it.
So what is the biggest environmental threat to oysters?
That's a really challenging question because it is so complicated and all of the threats interact with each other. So the answer really varies if we're thinking about wild oyster populations versus aquaculture populations, which started out in a hatchery. So, for example, ocean acidification is quite detrimental to oyster larvae. Ocean acidification is caused from increased levels of carbon dioxide in the water, and that may be due to atmospheric carbon dioxide increasing. But in coastal areas, there are many other reasons that cause increases in carbon dioxide. So that's really bad for larval oysters, but it doesn't seem to be as bad for juvenile and adult oysters. It seems like once they get past their larval stage, they are more resilient to ocean acidification. And in Maine, all of the farmed oysters start out in a hatchery. And in a hatchery, we can control the conditions and use a buffer to raise the pH of the water that we're growing the larvae in. And in fact, we do that at Mook Farm. And so it isn't really an issue for oysters that are starting out in a hatchery. But if we were thinking about a wild population of oysters where the larvae are growing in the ocean water, where there's nothing they can do, they're just in whatever pH they're in, that really could be a problem for them. And there are other aquaculture industries where there are not seed produced in a hatchery. So in Maine, the blue mussel industry and the sea scallop industry depend on wild set, where they put out spat collectors and they collect the wild spat. And those larvae will also be vulnerable to ocean acidification. And so one way to build resiliency to those industries would be to develop hatchery technology to raise those larvae in hatcheries. But at this point, it is more economical to collect the wild spat for those industries. Raising water temperatures cause the oysters to grow faster, and that is really beneficial to farmers because then we get to sell our product sooner. But also everything else grows faster in warmer waters. And so we have to spend more time managing the biofouling on our cages. So behind me, you see all of these oyster cages in water, and they're right at the surface. So there's a lot of sunlight, a lot of algae will grow on those cages. Other invertebrates like barnacles, mussels, sea squirts, they'll all be growing really fast. And so we periodically have to come along and Here, I'm going to kind of scoot over to this side because in the row that was right behind my shoulder, there are some cages that look a little bit different because those cages are upside down out of the water. And we do that on a periodic basis to dry the cages out, and that will kill all of the fouling organisms, but the oysters will be okay. And so that's a way to manage the biofouling, but we have to do that more often in warmer waters because other stuff grows. And then warmer waters also they increase the growth rates of microorganisms that might be pathogenic, either pathogenic to people, like Vibrio is an illness that you could get from oysters that are not handled properly, or pathogenic to the oysters and might kill the oysters. So there are oyster pathogens like MSX and dermo and juvenile oyster disease that might kill the oysters, and those become more abundant in warm waters. And then increases in storms that's really detrimental to aquaculture in particular, but maybe not so much to wild populations of oysters, because high winds and high wave activity can pull our cages off of their moorings and cause a lot of damage to our farm operations. And we could lose gear, we could lose oysters, and have to put a lot more labor into maintaining those systems. And then another environmental threat that is less direct on oysters, but more on the aquaculture businesses, is the threat of harmful algal blooms, which are increasing, it seems, with warming waters and other factors that may not all be fully understood. Oysters often do not die from consuming the harmful algae species, but then they can't be harvested if they accumulate biotoxins, because that will make people sick, and we certainly never want to make people sick. So the Department of Marine Resources watches that extremely carefully, and they do a wonderful job regulating that to make sure that the oysters that are harvested in Maine are safe for people to eat. So those are just some of the different environmental threats, and it's really hard to say which is the worst.
You mentioned spat a few times. Could you please explain what that is?
Spat and seed both refer to young juvenile shellfish. I believe that it is in some cases a regional difference, that in some regions they may say spat and in some regions they may say seed. In this part of Maine, it seems to be that we say seed when we refer to those that were raised in hatcheries, and we say spat when we refer to juveniles that developed in the wild.
I was wondering if you could, I was looking on your website, and I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on your time with the Northeastern Coastal Acidification Network and how it has helped you with Mook Sea Farm.
The Northeast Coastal Acidification Network, it's a group of scientists, state and federal agency members, funding agency members, some resource managers, some educational outreach people, for example, from Sea Grant, and also industry members. And we all work together to move forward communication, research, and education about ocean and coastal acidification. So I first joined NECAN while I was a postdoctoral researcher at Bigelow Laboratory for Ocean Sciences. And at that point, I was involved in the science subcommittee or the science working group of NECAN. And then when I came to Mook Sea Farm, I transitioned to the industry working group of the Northeast Coastal Acidification Network. And I would say that NECAN did not so much help me prepare for the issues that I was facing when I got to Mook Sea Farm, but rather it helped me build a network of colleagues out in my greater community outside of Mook Sea Farm. So it allowed me to connect to various experts who are not working right here with me at Mook Sea Farm. And so I have scientists who I can turn to and ask questions to, resource managers, extension agents. And so it provides opportunities for communication and collaboration with the broader community.
Where do you ship your seed? What's the furthest away you ship it?
We ship seed all the way from North Carolina to Maine. So we don't, yeah, that full range.
Do you stay along the east coast, basically?
Yes, for the seed, yes. But for the market oysters on our farm, they are shipped all over the country to restaurants all over the country.
Mhm. And then I have another question too, in terms of you talk about that they grow best in warm waters. So what happens in the wintertime to your oyster farm? What do you do with it?
Yeah, oysters don't grow in the wintertime. So they kind of go into this, it's kind of like hibernation, I guess. They just go into a period of rest. And if we leave the cages up on the surface, like you can see in the picture behind me, in that part of the Damariscotta River, the water freezes over and the ice will pull the cages off of their mooring. The oysters will be frozen into the ice, and that will be very damaging to the oysters and to all of the equipment. And so we have to sink the cages to the bottom of the river in the wintertime, and they're still not going to grow down there, but they will not be damaged down there. And so the way we sink them, you can see in these cages, each cage has a pair of black floats. Mm-hmm. And so we fill those floats with water, and then they no longer float and they sink down to the bottom. And then in the spring, we raise them up and they start growing again. However, we can't harvest from the cages that are at the bottom. And so we've taken a kind of unique approach to this, where we will move a set of cages that have market size oysters far down the river to an area where it does not ice over. And then we can harvest from those cages in the wintertime so that the farm can be operating year round.
When I was younger, my mother used to say, you get the best oysters during the months that end with R. So she would September, October, November, December are your best months for if you're going to buy them or order them. Do you think that's true? Still true?
No, that is a little bit dated. It came and it is based on two different things, and we have solutions to both of those things. So months without R are May, June, July, August, summer months when it's warm. First of all, the first issue is what I mentioned before, Vibrio bacteria that can make people sick. Mm-hmm. So before we had refrigeration, it was very risky to consume an oyster that had been harvested in those summer months when there is more Vibrio. Now we can get our oysters into refrigeration very, very quickly, and then they stay refrigerated throughout the entire supply chain, and then they are served to you on ice. And so they stay cold, and that really eliminates the risk of getting sick from those oysters unless someone makes a mistake. And then the other thing about those summer months is that that's the period when oysters reproduce. And so that's when those diploid oysters, their gonads swell up as they develop gonad tissue, and then they spawn out and they get really thin and low quality oysters. But since we have triploid oysters, the triploids don't go through that cycle, and so they stay high quality in the summer months as well.
I can't thank you enough for joining us.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you.